The New York Mets will be without starting pitcher Frankie Montas for the first few months of the season. How will they get by without him? Will they stay internal? Could they go out and make an addition to bolster this rotation? I'll break that down and more on today's show.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Well, Monday marked the first day of spring training for the New York Mets, or at least the first official day as they had their first full squad workouts. And sure enough, first day of camp, first major injury, because that is the tough reality of Major League Baseball. Guys are going to get hurt. And the first big injury the Mets have to deal with is losing one of their new additions. Frankie Montas will be out for what was reported initially as a significant amount of time. And that is an accurate report by Mike Puma of the New York Post, as it later came out from Carlos Mendoza that Frankie Montas has a high-grade lat strain. He threw his first side session when he got to camp, felt a lot of pain in his forearm, his side. They got it checked out, sent it to New York for further imaging that confirmed the diagnosis of a high-grade lat strain. He got a PRP injection to try to deal with some of the inflammation there. Hopefully, after 6 to 8 weeks, everything will sort of settle with that muscle, and he'll be able to get back to a throwing program. But then he's starting from square one. So Frankie Montas, at this point, best case scenario, gets to start his spring training the beginning of April. More likely, you're talking about middle of April, and that easily could bleed into May. Then you go from there. Imagine 6 to 7 weeks of your typical spring training progression to get ramped up to a full workload of 100 pitches. There's a good chance we don't see Frankie Montas until June. Best case scenario, middle of May, maybe somewhere in between. But you will not see Frankie Montas make a start for a very long time. He's going to miss probably a third of the season. So this is pretty significant. You're talking about, potentially as many as 10 starts that he could miss. Could be even more than that. You never know, especially when it's a high-grade strain, because it's prone to setbacks. And the other thing, too, one of the things that Frankie Montas talked about when he signed with the Mets was, how he really got better with the Brewers because he started to trust his body. So I'm really concerned here about what Montas will return as, because if he showed up to camp, he was healthy, he was letting it rip from day one, he was built up, he was working with the Mets staff, I feel really good about it. Now he misses this valuable time where everybody, all the resources the Mets have are in one place in Port St. Lucie. All the coaches collectively, so many guys that you can get tips from. And now the whole big league team leaves. He stays behind in Port St. Lucie. He starts his program. And yes, there's still resources there and there's still coaches, but Jeremy Hefner's got a big league staff to worry about. And I just really wonder, what we see from Frankie Montas now. This is a tough blow. And it's interesting because, on yesterday's show, I talked about Frankie Montas and I graded out the signing and I called it a C+. And I sort of said that, part of a grade even that high to this signing was just giving the Mets the benefit of the doubt from what happened last year with, seeing Luis Severino and Sean Manaea sign these prove-it deals and really make good on them. Montas signed a 2-year deal with an opt-out, and now you're thinking, good chance he's going to be here for 2 years. I don't know if that's necessarily a great thing. Here's what I said about the signing yesterday, which now kind of is a little bit eerie as we are now armed with this news that Montas is out. I look at that contract and I say, man, I think I would have preferred Buehler. And I also see Jose Quintana still on the market right now. And if you told me you can get Jose Quintana right now, 1 year, $13 million, and you could scrub away the Frankie Montas contract, I don't know. I think I might do that. Quintana's coming off a better season, and a 1-year deal is definitely less risk. There is a chance that Montas struggles or gets hurt, and that contract doesn't look as good next year. We can't just assume that because the Mets were amazing at this last year, they're going to hit on every single one of these guys. I hate being I hate predicting the future in that way. I guess you could say I jinxed Montas there, but then again, I said that well after the injury already took place, so you can't actually blame me on this one. We are going to talk about the idea of bringing back Jose Quintana in the next segment. I think it is a possibility and one the Mets should really explore. For now, though, you're looking at them, giving the public stance that they're going to stay internal here. I don't think that this necessitates them to overpay for Dylan Cease. And I don't know if Dylan Cease is even available in a trade right now. We can touch on that a little bit more in the next segment as well. But what the Mets have said, what Carlos Mendoza came out with is, hey, they're going to stay internal. They have a lot of options they like. And this is why you sign a Griffin Canning. I didn't love that Canning signing at the time, 1 year, $4.25 million. I thought, man, the Mets have a pretty loaded rotation already. They had brought in Montas. They had brought in Holmes. At that point, I can't remember if they had brought back Manaea or not, but regardless, they would eventually get Sean Manaea. The addition of Griffin Canning felt like some surplus because they still have Paul Blackburn to factor into that mix. They still have David Peterson. So when you think about it now, all of a sudden, Canning, I think he's a shoo-in to make the opening day rotation because assuming health for the other guys, and big knock on wood there, Kodai Senga looks good right now. Sean Manaea, David Peterson, Clay Holmes, those guys were already going to be written into that rotation in pen. Now I think you got a pretty sharp pencil written in there of Griffin Canning's name as the fifth starter. He can't be optioned. He has to be on your roster. He's healthy. The Mets believe that they can get some more out of him, and they're going to have to prove that they were right on that. And then the other question is, do you go with the six-man rotation, or do you just stick with the five-man rotation and let this thing play out and see if Paul Blackburn can be good to go? Because Blackburn, he's dealing with an injury, or at least he's coming back from an injury. He had that spinal fluid leak that needed surgery. The timeline for return had opening day as a possibility, but there is every chance he might need a 15-day IL stint to start the season. So if the Mets wanted to, they could roll with what they got with the five-man rotation, put Blackburn on the 15-day IL. If they started Kodai Senga in that third spot in the rotation, he would not come up where you would need a sixth starter until April 16th. So that could be that buffer period because you have enough off days to make it through. And then Blackburn, when he's healthy, you slide him into the rotation. You go from there. Or you stick with the six-man rotation, and the inevitable that I've talked about for the last couple of weeks comes to fruition. Tylor Megill ends up in this opening day rotation. So what I'm going to talk about in the next segment is that possibility. Is Megill now destined to be part of this opening day rotation? I'll also go through the possible acquisition of Jose Quintana or Dylan Cease. So we'll talk about all of that in just a minute. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Select Quote. In sports, having a winning strategy is everything. It's how the best teams make it to the Super Bowl or to the World Series. And the same goes for having a strategy like life insurance from Select Quote, which can protect you for your financial legacy and keep your family's future secure. Select Quote makes it easy to find the perfect life insurance policy. As one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, they've helped over 2 million customers find $700 billion in coverage since 1985. If you're in good health, you might even qualify for same-day coverage of up to $5 million, no medical exam required, and it's more affordable than you'd think. You can get up to $1 million in coverage for as little as $20 a month. Get the right life insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/lockedon. Go to selectquote.com/lockedon today to get started. That's selectquote.com/lockedon. Select Quote. They shop, you save. Stay up to date with all the latest in the world of sports when you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. And if you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Our next goal is to get to 13,000 subscribers by opening day. Appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. All right, so will Tylor Megill make the opening day rotation? Let's start there because this is something that I've been joking about over the last couple of weeks. How every single year we go into camp and I'm previewing the season for the Mets and I say, yep, Tylor Megill's on the outside looking in. He's probably going to start the year in Syracuse because there's just no room for him. You talk about 2022 after his rookie season, the Mets brought in Max Scherzer and Chris Bassett. They had Jacob deGrom. They had David Peterson. They had Carlos Carrasco. Plenty of starting pitchers. No room for Tylor Megill. What happens? Jacob deGrom goes down. Tylor Megill gets that nod to be part of the opening day rotation. He actually made, I think, the opening day start, if I do recall correctly. And he actually pitched like DeGrom for a month, was part of the combined no-hitter, and then he got hurt and things sort of went on a tailspin for him after that. But we saw in 2022, 2023, the Mets bring in Justin Verlander, Kodai Senga, Jose Quintana. They had David Peterson still, who was their sixth starter. Who else was in that rotation that I'm forgetting? Am I missing a name? I might be, but regardless, you go into camp, no shot at Megill making the team. What happens? Quintana goes down. That was David Peterson getting a spot. You still didn't have a clear place for Tyler Megill. Then, right before opening day, I remember actually it was on opening day. I was driving down to Miami with my dad. I pulled into the garage, and we find out, sure enough, Justin Verlander would start the year on the IL, and Megill snuck his way in the absolute 11th hour into the rotation. Last year, it was Kodai Senga that went down. Tyler Megill ends up getting a spot. So this is a yearly theme. That's why if you enter camp 7th on the depth chart, good chance you're going to find your way into the rotation, particularly this year where you're dealing with the questions about Paul Blackburn. Montas goes down. It feels like the Mets will probably just start the season with Megill, and then you'll see, right? You go into the year, you roll with this 6-man rotation. By the time Blackburn's good to go, and this is assuming that he won't be for opening day, you see what the first couple starts bring. If Megill looks great, Canning does not. You slide Canning into the bullpen. You put Blackburn into the rotation, and you go from there. If Megill looks bad, you option him down. I think that's where the Mets are likely going. At the same time, even prior to this injury, there was part of me that was quietly beating the drum for the Mets to still sign Jose Quintana because he's just out there. You can sign him, and he makes your rotation better. I would have felt, even before this injury, that the Mets signed Quintana, he would be the 4th best starter on paper. Now, I believe in Clay Holmes making this work. But going into opening day, I'm not going to put him above established big league starting pitchers. So I would have said, come opening day, I would have looked at the Mets rotation and said, you know what? The number one's Kodai Senga. Sean Manaea is a 1B in this particular rotation. David Peterson's probably the 3. And then I would say if you brought in Quintana, he might be the 4 over Montas, over Holmes. This is a guy that is coming off a really good season. He pitched to an ERA that was sub 4 last year in the 3.7s. You look at what he did, 3.75 ERA across 170 and a third innings pitch. He was nails in September, nails in October, started both of the clinching games for the Mets in the playoffs. Game 3 of the NL wild card, he goes 6 scoreless. Game 4 of the LDS against the Phillies, he goes 5 scoreless. He was so good until he faced the Dodgers, and that was just a tough matchup for anybody. I'm looking at Quintana right now, a guy that fits seamlessly in that clubhouse, who can be a leader for that staff, who knows how to pitch in that ballpark, did a great job keeping the ball on the ground with Francisco Lindor behind him in the infield. I think Quintana makes the Mets better, and I don't really see the downside outside of course, spending the money to do it and bringing him in right now. You bring him in and you figure it out whenever Montas comes back. At this stage, I look at Frankie Montas and I say, you know what? I hope it works in 2026. I'm not saying he's not going to pitch for the Mets in 2025. Don't get it twisted. He should make starts for the Mets this year. But I don't feel as confident that you're going to get this breakout success that you were hoping for, a bounce back success. Going back to what he was in 2021. You're talking about a major injury for a guy that has been injured for the last 3 or 4 years. Last year was a healthy season, but again, he talked about it. He didn't feel right. He didn't trust his body until he got to Milwaukee halfway through the year. So, or really more 2/3 of the way into the year. So is he going to trust his body coming off this injury? Is he going to let it rip? I hope so. But that already question mark of what was he going to be, that just got even, larger of a question mark. You're talking about Blackburn. You're talking about Canning. These are guys that have proven enough to be 5th starters, but that's sort of at best. They haven't really had great careers. They could, do more with the Mets. Guys that the Mets like, clearly, but you're banking on them right now. You have Tyler Megill. I think he has more upside than, those two guys. I really think that Megill has a chance to be a better pitcher than either Canning or Blackburn. But he's been very up and down throughout his career. David Peterson has been, Jekyll and Hyde. It's 1 year on, 1 year off. I was talking to Anthony Rivera from the Subway to Shea podcast, and we were talking about how it's sort of been odd year off, even year on for Peterson. 2020 rookie year, he was great. 2022 in a sort of split role between the bullpen and the rotation, had a lot of success. 21 and 23 were his worst seasons. I expect David Peterson, coming off his first full year off of the hip surgery, I think he's going to be good, but that's not a guarantee. Clay Holmes has been a reliever his entire career, basically, outside of a couple starts in Pittsburgh when he was very young and early on. I mean, where's the Givens in this rotation? Sean Manaea is the one guy that you feel 100% confident in. And again, Peterson's probably the second most in that category. And if Kodai Senga is healthy, we know what he brings to the table. But this is a rotation that already had questions that is just dealing with a massive blow. I'd bring in Quintana and figure it out. I bring him on, see what happens. If Blackburn and Canning are great, well, that's your six-man rotation. And Megill is just waiting in the wings in AAA because at some point, somebody else is going to get hurt. And then Megill slides in. If that never happens and you're blessed with incredible health until Montas is ready, well, at that point, you have to make a decision. One of those six starters is not going to be having a good year. If it's Clay Holmes, perfect. You slide him back into the bullpen. He's going to be able to figure that out again. If it's Blackburn or Canning, they're not making that much money. You can DFA them. If it's Quintana, well, it's a one-year deal. If you have to cut bait, thank you for getting us through the last couple months. Sorry, you don't have it anymore, and you cut bait. But the Mets are in a position where I understand that spending $13 million or something along those lines to get Quintana back is probably a lot because you're going to have to think about the luxury tax payment. But you also never know what his market is right now because he still hasn't signed. Could you put $8 million in front of him? Would he bite at it? You never know. I feel like you have to at least open that dialogue and see what it takes to bring him back because he makes you better right now. He just simply does. So I would do it. I don't think they're going to do it, though, because I think the Mets really have this trust in their depth and the acquisitions they've made. They believe in Canning. They believe in Blackburn. They believe in Megill. And you know what? If those guys don't work, you have Brandon Sproat waiting in the wings technically. And you never know what could pry free in the middle of the season. Maybe it gets to a point where you just think, hey, we're going to need an ace here. And the Marlins, they made a pretty early trade last year with Luis Ariz. If you meet a high price point on a trade, maybe you can get Sandy Alcantara. Maybe Edward Cabrera looks good for them and you can pull a trade off there. I just don't think that David Stearns is the GM that's going to be reactionary to this. He will probably be listening and keeping his ears to the ground on the starting pitching market a little bit closer now. And obviously, if it really is still out there that the Padres are shopping Dylan Cease, maybe this is the incentive to go more all in on that type of a deal. But I don't think the Mets are going to trade Jet Williams or Brandon Sproat to get Dylan Cease. So it would have to get to a point where the Padres feel like they have to do a trade now because they don't want to do a trade in the middle of the season and they literally cannot afford him. And so they look at trying to get years of control for this starting pitcher and they say, you know what, we'll take Luis and Acuna and whatever else you had to put on the table to get a deal done. I just don't foresee that. I really don't. I was actually kicking the can or just kicking the idea around in my head about would the Mets trade David Peterson for Dylan Cease? And maybe we'll talk about that at another time because, David Peterson only has 2 years left to control. Could you sell high on Peterson in a Dylan Cease trade? I don't know. I don't know what's possible there. But again, that's not a reality that you can really explore. That's still sort of a pipe dream. So if you're talking about realistic outcomes right now, I think the Mets are either going to stick with what they have, and you're going to see Griffin Canning and Tyler Megill in an opening day six-man rotation. You're going to see, Canning in the bullpen. Megill is part of a five-man rotation, and you're waiting on Blackburn. Maybe Blackburn's healthy and he's in the rotation with one of those guys. It's those three guys for two spots now instead of those three guys for one spot in the rotation. And that's how we sort of have to assume this thing goes. Hopefully, the Mets are right that their pitching lab can rebuild some of these guys or even, build them to places that they've never been. And maybe at the end of April, we're looking up at Griffin Canning or saying, man, this guy's been fantastic. You really never know. But for now, the Mets are just going to sort of take this injury in stride with Montas, let spring play out. And if something else happens, I think they would obviously be even more inclined to go after Quintana right now. seems like they're still at this point happy with what they have. But we'll see. We'll see how everything continues to progress throughout spring training. I want to switch gears, though, in the final segment. Pete Alonso spoke to the media for the first time since the long saga over his contract. He had a lot of interesting things to say, and I think he reminded us all why this guy's been such a fan favorite for so long. So I want to talk about some of the highlights of the Pete Alonso presser in just a minute. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. If you are an everyday listener to the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service where you get updates from me anytime news breaks in the Mets. You can ask me questions anytime. You can also take part in our Locked On Mets sign photo giveaways. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Pete Alonso is back in a Mets uniform. We saw him with his teammates today, going through all the drills, big smile on his face. And then we saw him meet with the media, and I was really impressed with what we heard. Pete Alonso, not the most eloquent speaker, and that hasn't changed, but I thought he said a lot of the right things, and I thought he gave some really interesting answers. I think the most intriguing thing that I heard out of him was acknowledging his lack of success the last couple of years. When Pete Alonso was sort of, asked about a tough year last season from the media, he always sort of pushed it aside. I still have a chance to hit 40 home runs. And I think part of that was, trying to deal with, the Scott Boras playbook of, how to get paid in free agency and trying to say the right things. And, I think it was sort of an awkward year last year. And I thought Pete Alonso looked confident, looked comfortable, looked secure. I was really wondering how this was going to go because it could have gone the other way. Pete Alonso could have showed up and kind of dodged the questions and, just said, this was the best deal I could get, and I'm happy to be back, and said the right things. But, you could have seen a lack of feeling behind what he was saying, and sort of, you could have seen Pete Alonso be a little more robotic in his answers and just, potentially show that there is still some animosity towards how all this went. And Pete, I think, was brilliant. And I don't think it was necessarily a brilliant thought out set of answers from him, but more just, he kind of brilliantly set aside any narrative of any strife between him and the Mets, because he just was glowing about how much he loves being a Met, which we've always known. And I think, for any Mets fans that got tired of Pete throughout the process, I hope you watch Pete Alonso speak here. It was 20 minutes where he just showed his outpouring of support for every facet of the Mets organization, how much he loves being a Met, which is what I was always talking about on this show. And I thought was always clear that he wanted to be back. And he said that time and again. He was flat out asked about coming back to the Mets. And if anything ever got close, were you ever close to going anywhere else? He said, for me, this was it. I'm really happy to be back. This was it. He always knew that the Mets were the team he wanted to sign with. And throughout this entire process, I don't think he ever lost sight of that. He mentioned how you can't believe everything you read on the internet. And I think a lot of the smoke that came around Pete Alonso came from his side, all the teams that were floated and everything else. But Pete Alonso, I think, spent this offseason staying committed to his work and letting the contract stuff play out, without him being too involved. And he mentioned how much he appreciated the Mets visiting him and having that in-person meeting. And once they got face-to-face, they got a deal done. But again, getting back to sort of pushing off the idea of a bad year, he acknowledged it. He said, I didn't have my best year. It's no secret. When he's asked about the market, were you surprised the market wasn't there for you? He said that, he couldn't have expected something incredibly mega large, which is what he said. 2 years that were stacked up when he talked about 23 and 24, where he didn't play up to his potential. He said he couldn't expect to get a 10-year deal when he didn't have necessarily his best years in 23 and 24. So I thought that was really refreshing to hear Pete Alonso sort of own that there's been some struggles, but also express some confidence that he can get back to what he had been prior, that he still has better years ahead of him. I just really felt like Pete Alonso said all the right things, even though he stumbled through them. And, he answered questions the way Pete Alonso typically has throughout his career, but in a very endearing way. I just felt like he said everything he would wanted to. And, when asked about not getting the long-term deal. Did he regret not signing that extension? He talked about how he has bet on himself at every step of his career, from high school to college to each year. When you think about what he's done in the big leagues, it's always been a bet on himself. He's always going to go out and expect the best results. And he talked about just wanting to win and the optimism around the team and how excited he was, to continue to be part of this group. He said the most fulfilling part about being back today was just that the story continues. He said that, he's really stoked about what the Mets did this offseason. He's excited to play with Juan Soto. He feels prepared. He's excited. The stars are aligned, he said. Opening day can't come soon enough. I just thought every single thing that he was asked, he continued to affirm he loves being with the Mets. There's no animosity towards the Mets. He was asked about that too. Are the relationships changed? He said, no, it didn't change any relations for me at all. For me, I'm just happy it got done. He said, he's sure Steve and David are happy it got done. He talked about how these are the people who have continuously believed in me throughout my entire career. He, talked about getting drafted by the Mets. These are the people that have believed in him from day one. He said, having the negotiations go, you put that aside. This place, this team, these people have believed in me from day one. And that means a lot to me. I mean, every single thing he said, really does put any, questions about Pete Alonso going to the season to rest. And I think he looks so confident and comfortable. And he mentioned, getting $30 million is a win for him. It does push things along for the next in line when it comes to first baseman. I thought it was pretty interesting to hear Scott Boras go on Foul Territory today too, talking about Pete Alonso amongst his other free agents. And he mentioned how the first base market has been impacted by the best at the position signing, pre-arb or arbitration deals. Before they hit free agency, Paul Goldschmidt and Matt Olson, he mentioned signing those contracts where, their deals aren't a reflection of what a first baseman should make in the market. He talked about how, Freddie Freeman signed an extension before he got to free agency, then hit free agency at 32 years old. And so you haven't had a true top flight first baseman hit free agency in a long time, dating back to those days of Prince Fielder and Mark Teixeira and all those guys. And while you don't necessarily have to agree with all of Scott Boras' rationale, I do understand why a bridge contract makes sense for Pete Alonso and how he can make good on it. How without the qualifying offer encumbering him, if he goes out this season and it's a return to 2022 Pete Alonso or 2019 Pete Alonso, and he hits 45 plus homers and he drives in 120 plus and he gets that OPS, over 850, and he just has a really solid year, that Pete Alonso could get a long-term deal. And I think that long-term deal could still come for the Mets. Is it going to be 6 years next offseason? No, but the market dictates a 5-year deal. I think there is a, bridge to that deal come with the Mets on this bridge contract. How there could be an extension that happens in the middle of this season. If near the end of the year, just like Matt Chapman got a new deal, if everything has worked out great for Pete, maybe these sides do come together and say, you know what, let's actually negotiate. I think it's more likely it plays out in the offseason. But to me, when you see what Pete Alonso says, and people are going to combat this and say, oh, no, they want Vladdy. The Mets hate Pete. David Stearns doesn't want to go multiple years with Pete Alonso. And I understand that sentiment. But when you have a guy that's this committed to the organization, I don't think that you should just completely throw that aside. When you're talking about a guy that when you look at run production and home run production has been atop the league since his debut, a guy that can have the New York media eating out of his hand, that's a fan favorite, that is going to get the home run record this year, I don't think that this is a player that you just cast aside for the new face, especially when David Stearns is on the record just recently saying that you can only have one Juan Soto contract on your books. Vladdy did not get an extension up to this point from the Blue Jays because he probably wants $400 to $500 million. So I don't think the Mets are necessarily going to be swimming in those waters like fans expect. So I look at Pete Alonso right now and I say he is in a great position to have a monster season this year. He can hit the market. There will be a more fair assessment of his value. He will bring that contract back to the Mets every single time because he obviously wants to be a Met. and the Mets will have to decide if it's worth it to them. And I think if the market speaks on Pete Alonso and it is a longer term commitment that he gets, but a reasonable, market value where it's a 5-year deal in the 22, 23, $24 million range, I think some dialogue will be had and a deal could get done in a winter. But for now, I think the Mets and Pete Alonso are in a great spot. I'm not concerned at all about these negotiations bleeding into the season. Alonso has $30 million he's making this year. And I think that did give him a renewed sense of comfort and confidence in his standing within the organization. And he's got a pillow to fall back on with that player option. So I expect the most out of Pete. And I wanted to close the show today with the two big laughs that Pete Alonso got. Here's what Pete said about getting that franchise record.
Pete, you've talked a lot about the team goals trying to get back this year, but for you personally, you've got an opportunity this year to set the Mets all-time home run record. Have you given that much thought, and what would that mean to you?
No, I haven't given it any thought. No, I mean, that's, yeah, of course I've given it thought. I think that's, again, to be able to have that is special, and to do it in the, granted, if I stay healthy and go out and do it, if that were to happen, I mean, yeah, that's something I've been thinking about, and to be a part of this franchise in that way, because, I mean, that would be really special.
This is why Pete Alonso was never leaving. He wants that record, and rightfully so. He has earned that record. No one has hit home runs the way Pete Alonso has across 6 years of his career with the Mets. No one has gotten off to that level of a start. He deserves that record, and so I'm really excited to watch him go out and chase it. The other great quote from Pete Alonso, he was asked multiple times about being exhausted, or the Steve Cohen comments about being exhausted by the negotiations. He was asked by, I believe this is Tim Healy, if he was ever exhausted. And here's what Pete Alonso's response was.
Following up on Jake's question, one of the things Steve said was that the negotiations were exhausting. Were they at any point exhausting for you?
Not for me.
Maybe for Scott.
Yeah, we were good. We were all good. Well, I guess that means we're sorry, Steve.
So what that tells me is, for one, Pete Alonso, I shouldn't reveal too much. Here's what I'll tell you right now. Pete Alonso was never, not for a single second, not on the 10-yard line, none of that ridiculousness. He was never going anywhere else. And he knew that, and Scott Boras knew that. And honestly, I think to a certain extent, the New York Mets knew that. And yes, they had to come to terms on the deal, and that got ugly. But when he says he wasn't sweating it and Scott Boras wasn't sweating it, it's because they knew that at some point the Mets would re-engage. And he apologizes to Steve there. That's just candid Pete Alonso. Oh, I probably shouldn't say that, stumbling over his words. And you see the way the media responds to him, because this is a guy that has endeared himself to a fan base, to the media for 6 great years, and he's going to have at least one more. And I would not be surprised if there is actually many more after that, despite all of the drama that surrounded him this offseason. So I have listened to the full 20 minutes now, I think 3 times, once when it happened, once a little bit later as I was taking some other notes for the show, and then kind of a third time when I was pulling the exact quotes that I wanted to reference here. It's a fun listen. So check that out. You can find it on the Mets YouTube channel and SNY's. But Pete Alonso is back with the Mets, happy to be back with the Mets, and ready for a big season. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. I appreciate all of you for tuning in. If you're listening on the audio side, make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor, hit the like button for this video. If you enjoy what you saw, hit the subscribe button. Help us get to our next goal of 13,000 subscribers by opening day. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, be part of our texting service, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listener, your first watch every day. Now for your second watch, head over to YouTube and check out the first ever 24/7 streaming channel that covers everything in the world of sports. We're talking about Locked On Sports today with our local hosts from each team, league-wide hosts from each league. Find Locked On Sports today streaming 24/7 on YouTube.